Here's an important takeaway note on the following article. Do not be misled by politicians' use of the phrase price on carbon or carbon price. This is almost always a code phrase indicating they have worked out a scheme with special interests, or plan to work out a scheme. Eddie Evans, Young People's Burden, the 4th of October 2016. James Hansen, Young People's Burden, Requirement of Negative CO2 Emissions, by 12 of Us 1, is being made available as a discussion paper in Earth System Dynamics discussion on 4 October, as it is undergoing peer review. We try to make the science transparent to non-scientists. A video discussion by my granddaughter Sophie and me is available. Here I first note a couple of our technical conclusions, but you can skip straight to principal implications on page 2. 1. Global temperature. The 12-month running mean temperature is now plus 1.3 degrees Celsius relative to the 1880 to 1920 average in the GEOSTEMP analysis, figure 2 in above paper or alternative figure 1 below. We suggest that 1880 to 1920 is a good choice for pre-industrial base period. Alternative choices would differ by only about plus minus 0.1 degrees Celsius, and 1880 to 1920 has the advantage of being the earliest time with reasonably global coverage and reasonably well-documented measurement technology. Present 12-month running mean global temperature jumps about as far above the linear trend line, figure 2b in the paper, as it did during the 1997-98 El Nino. The linear trend line is now at plus 1.06 degrees Celsius, which is perhaps the best temperature to compare to paleoclimate temperatures, because the latter are centennially smoothed. That is, the proxy measures of ancient temperature typically have a resolution not better than 100 years. The present linear trend, or 11-year mean, temperature is appropriate for comparison to centennially smoothed paleotemperature, because we have knowledge that decadal temperature will not be declining in the next several decades. 2. The growth of the three principal human-caused greenhouse gases, GHGs, CO2, CH4, N2O, are all accelerating. Contrary to the impression favored by governments, the corner has not been turned toward declining emissions and GHG amounts. The world is not effectively addressing the climate matter, nor does it have any plans to do so, regardless of how much government bureaucrats clap each other on the back. On the other hand, accelerating GHG growth rates do not imply that the problem is unsolvable or that amplifying climate feedbacks are now the main source of the acceleration. Despite much valid concern about amplifying climate methane feedbacks and leaks from fracking activity, the isotopic data suggest that the increase of CH4 emissions is more a result of agricultural emissions. Not to say that it will be easy, but it is still possible to get future CH4 amount to decline moderately, as we phase off fossil fuels as the principal energy source. Principal implications: a global temperature is already at the level of the Eocene period, 130,000 to 115,000 years ago, when sea level was 69 meters, 20-30 feet, higher than today, figure 2. Considering the additional warming in the pipeline, due to delayed response of the climate system and the impossibility of instant replacement of fossil fuels, additional temperature rise is inevitable. Earth's history shows that the lag of sea level change behind global temperature change is 1-4 centuries for natural climate change. Grant et al. 2012, 2014 2. It is unlikely that response would be slower to a stronger, more rapid human-made climate forcing. Indeed, Hansen et al. 2016, infer that continued high fossil fuel emissions could lead to multi-meter sea level rise in 150 years. The desire to avoid large ice sheet shrinkage and sea level rise implies a need to get global temperature back into or close to the Holocene range on the time scale of a century or less. B. Negative CO2 emissions, that is, extraction of CO2 from the air, is now required, if climate is to be stabilized on the century time scale, as a result of past failure to reduce emissions. If rapid phase-down of fossil fuel emissions begins soon, most of the necessary CO2 extraction can take place via improved agricultural and forestry practices, including reforestation and steps to improve soil fertility and increase its carbon content. In this case, the magnitude and duration of global temperature excursion above the natural range of the current interglacial Holocene could be limited and irreversible climate impacts could be minimized. See continued high fossil fuel emissions place a burden on young people to undertake massive technological CO2 extraction. Quietly, with minimal objection from the scientific community, Anderson, 2015, is a courageous exception. The assumption that young people will somehow figure out a way to undo the deeds of their forebears has crept into and spread like a cancer through UN climate scenarios. Proposed methods of extraction such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BICS, or air capture of CO2 imply minimal estimated costs of $570 trillion this century, with large risks and uncertain feasibility. Continued high fossil fuel emissions unarguably sentences young people to either a massive, possibly implausible cleanup or growing deleterious climate impacts or both. Scenarios that should provide incentive and obligation for governments to alter energy policies without further delay. Personal opinions about the relevance of this paper. The Paris Climate Accord is a precatory agreement, wishful thinking that mainly reaffirms, 23 years later, the 1992 Rio Framework Convention on Climate Change. The developing world need for abundant, affordable, reliable energy is largely ignored, even though it is a basic requirement to eliminate global poverty and war. Instead, the developed world pretends to offer reparations, a vaporous $100 billion/year, while allowing climate impacts to grow. President Obama seems not to understand that as long as fossil fuels are allowed to appear to the user to be the cheapest reliable energy, they will continue to be the world's largest energy source, and the likelihood of disastrous consequences for young people will grow to near certainty. Obama proudly states that his EPA regulations can actually produce a greater emissions reduction than would his initial nearly worthless proposal of a cap-and-trade scheme. Obama salves his conscience by noting his agreement to share information with China on carbon capture and storage, which neither nation will ever employ at the scale needed to deal with the climate problem, and his plans to be a climate ambassador in his old age. See, technically, it is still possible